It's October 1978. Late, past midnight. Santa Monica Boulevard is doing what LA always does at that hour, warm pavement, jasmine coming through somewhere, the distant hum of the city that never fully goes to sleep. Inside a recording studio called Westlake Audio, wood-paneled walls, a mixing console so wide it takes two people to reach both ends, a 19-year-old kid is standing in a vocal booth with his headphones around his neck. Eyes already on the glass, already reading the room before anyone has said a single word. The tape has just stopped. Not because the reel ran out, not because anything went technically wrong. The engineer, a guy named Gerald who had been working that studio for 11 years, reached over and killed the playback himself. Quietly, the way you close a door when someone is sleeping. Because something had shifted in that room, everyone felt it. And nobody wanted to be the one who broke the silence first. What happened in the next 4 hours would not show up in any official timeline of Michael Jackson's career. It wasn't filmed. It wasn't photographed. Most of the people who heard about it third hand, years later, through the memory of one engineer who was careful with details. But what happened in that studio on that night is arguably the most important moment in the history of modern pop music. Not the recording of Thriller, not the moonwalk, not the Grammys. This night, this conversation, this fourth take. And almost nobody knows the full story. Hey, before we go any further, if you're into deep dives like this, stories that go behind the legend and find the actual human moment underneath it, hit subscribe. I put a lot of time into these, and I genuinely think this one is going to stay with you. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened that October night, you need to understand what Michael Jackson was actually carrying into that studio. And most people have no idea. Michael Jackson was 9 years old the first time he performed professionally. 9. Which sounds impressive until you understand what professionally meant in the Jackson household. It meant Joseph Jackson, his father, had already decided that his sons were a meal ticket. That's not a harsh interpretation, that's documented. Joe Jackson has said in interviews that he saw the potential and he monetized it. He used a belt during rehearsals. He belittled the boys in front of each other. He told Michael specifically on more than one occasion that he was ugly, that his nose was too big, that he needed to be better. Now I want to be careful here because this isn't a video about tearing down Joe Jackson. The full complexity of that man and that household deserves its own conversation. But what matters for tonight's story is this. Michael Jackson learned from the earliest age that love was conditional on performance. That safety came from being good enough. That you survived rehearsal by not giving anyone a reason to stop it and correct you. And so he got very, very good at being correct. By the time the Jackson 5 signed with Motown in 1969, Michael was 11. 11 years old and already a consummate professional. Already capable of doing something most singers spend their whole careers chasing. He could step into a recording booth and give you exactly what you asked for. On demand, technically flawless, emotionally precise. Berry Gordy, who ran Motown and had seen everything, said he had never encountered a kid like Michael. Diana Ross, who was one of his earliest mentors, said the same thing. He had a gift for mimicry that was almost uncanny. He could hear a vocal style once and replicate it. He could absorb phrasing, rhythm, delivery like a sponge. But here's the thing about mimicry as a survival skill. It keeps you safe. It keeps you correct. It keeps you from doing anything that someone might stop you in the middle of and criticize. It does not necessarily let you be yourself. Michael was a songwriter from a very young age. He kept a cassette recorder on his nightstand. Songs would come to him at 2, 3 in the morning. He'd talked about this in interviews, and he'd sit up and record them before they disappeared. Melodies, lyrics, full arrangements that existed only in his head. Those songs were entirely his. Nobody could get to them. His father didn't know they existed. Motown didn't have claim to them. They lived in the dark, in the hour before dawn, in the private interior of a kid who had spent his whole life making himself small enough to survive his circumstances. The question, the real question, the one Quincy Jones was going to spend 6 weeks circling before he finally named it directly, was this. Could Michael take what was in those 3 AM cassettes and put it in front of a microphone? Or had the armor grown too thick? By 1978, Michael was 19, and he had just finished filming The Wiz, the all-black reimagining of The Wizard of Oz that also starred Diana Ross and Richard Pryor. It was on that set that he met Quincy Jones, who was doing the musical arrangements for the film. Now, Quincy Jones in 1978 is not someone you need to introduce. The man had already had one of the most storied careers in American music. He'd played trumpet alongside Ray Charles as a teenager. He'd arranged for Frank Sinatra. He'd composed film scores, produced jazz records, worked with everyone from Ella Fitzgerald to Count Basie. He was 45 years old and he had heard everything. But there was something about Michael Jackson that caught his ear in a different way. He would later say that Michael had the most precise natural instrument he had ever encountered. Not the most powerful voice, not the most technically trained, the most precise. The ability to place a note with an accuracy that most singers develop over decades of formal study, and Michael just had it, naturally, instinctively. When the time came for Michael to record his first truly solo album, not a Motown project, not a Jackson 5 project, he called Quincy. And Quincy said yes under one condition. They were going to make something that had never been heard before. Not another disco record, not another soul record. Something that lived at the edge of all of those things and pointed somewhere new. Something that sounded like it belonged to nobody and to the future simultaneously. Sessions began at Westlake Audio in the summer of 1978. And for the first 5 weeks, by most accounts, things went well, professionally. The sessions were productive. Michael was, as he always was, technically excellent. Songs were being recorded, tracks were being laid down, everything was moving. But Quincy kept hearing a gap. Not in the musicianship, not in the vocals, technically, something else, something harder to name. He described it in interviews years later as the difference between watching someone paint and watching someone bleed onto a canvas. Both can produce beautiful work, but only one of them has skin in the game. Michael was painting perfectly, and Quincy needed him to bleed a little. The problem was Quincy didn't know yet exactly what was holding Michael back. He knew something was. He could hear the place where the performance ended and the person should have begun, and the person wasn't there. A door that should have been open was closed, locked even. He spent week after week probing for the edge of it, suggesting different approaches, different keys, different production choices, asking Michael to try things emotionally rather than technically. And Michael, every time, would give him something technically excellent and emotionally buttoned up. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't ego. Quincy understood this. This was something deeper, something structural. The kind of thing you can't just ask someone to stop doing because they don't even know they're doing it. By week 6, Quincy had made a decision. He had written something on a legal pad. He turned it face down. And he waited for the right moment. The night of the conversation, there were only 4 people in the room. Michael in the vocal booth, Quincy at the console, Gerald the engineer, and 2 session musicians who, at the right moment, read the room, grabbed their jackets, and left without being asked. Gerald killed the tape. The door closed with a soft click that sounded, in the silence, much louder than it was. And Quincy said, "You know what I heard tonight?" Michael said nothing. "I heard a kid who is afraid to be a man." Now stop right there, because that sentence is doing a lot of things at once, and it's worth sitting with. Quincy Jones is not a cruel man. He is also not a man who softens a hard truth to the point of uselessness. He'd spent decades in studios with some of the most talented people in the world, and he knew that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is say the precise uncomfortable thing that they've been circling without nomming. He wasn't insulting Michael, he was diagnosing him. The word afraid is doing the heavy lifting there. Not bad, not wrong, not insufficient, afraid, because fear is something you can address. Fear is something that has a source. Fear is something that, once named, can be dismantled. Quincy continued. He said everything Michael had brought him was good. And then he said the thing that probably landed harder than anything else. Good is not what we're here for. He told Michael that good is what gets released by every talented 20-year-old who thinks he can sing. Good is the floor, not the ceiling. And Michael was capable of something so far above good that settling for good was almost an act of dishonesty. Then he named it the actual thing. He said every time you get close to something real, you pull back. You go back to the safe voice, the one that already worked, the one nobody can criticize. And the reason, Quincy said this directly, the reason isn't habit. It's insurance. If you hold back and it fails, you can tell yourself you held back. You still have an exit. You still have an excuse. But if you give everything, all of it, and it fails, Then there's nothing left to hide behind. Think about what Quincy was actually saying. He wasn't just talking about singing. He was describing a survival strategy that Michael had built over a decade, one that had served him well and was now the very thing standing between him and his full potential. He was saying the armor kept you alive, and now the armor is the cage. Michael sat across the table. His jaw was tight. He was looking down. And then he raised his head and asked, very quietly, not defeated, not angry, just quiet, "What do you want me to do?" Quincy said, "I want you to sing the song the way you hear it at 3 in the morning when nobody is watching." Michael stood up, picked up his jacket, and went back into the booth without another word. And here's where the story gets complicated, and honestly more honest. Because if this were a movie, a clean, satisfying narrative arc, the very next take after that conversation would be the breakthrough. Michael would walk back in, hit record, and out would pour something transcendent, and Quincy would lean back and the engineer would cry a single tasteful tear and roll credits. That's not what happened. The first 3 takes after the conversation were, by Gerald's account, worse than anything that had come before in 6 weeks of sessions. Not technically worse, Michael's voice was always technically clean, that never wavered, but emotionally tighter, more controlled, more closed off. Think about why. You have just had a conversation where someone told you that your most fundamental coping mechanism is also your biggest limitation. You have just been told, essentially, to be more vulnerable in front of people. And vulnerability, for anyone who has spent their life using performance as protection, does not turn on like a faucet. You become more self-conscious, not less. The conversation had put a spotlight on the thing he was trying not to do, and now every note felt watched. Every choice felt examined. The walls, paradoxically, went higher. Gerald kept his hands away from the intercom. Quincy did not press the talkback button. He didn't coach. He didn't encourage. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, completely still. And his stillness was its own kind of communication. It said, "I am not stopping this. I am not rescuing you. You have to find the door yourself." The 4th take started the same way the first 3 had. The count-in, the opening bars, the first line delivered correctly, placed perfectly, technically right. Gerald was watching the levels. Quincy had his pen moving. And then the pen stopped. Not the tape, the pen. Quincy's hand went still on the legal pad. His head came up from his notes. He turned to look through the glass at the booth. And his expression changed. Gerald said he had never seen that expression on Quincy's face before, not in 6 weeks, not ever. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't excitement. It was something quieter and more absolute. The expression, Gerald said, of a man recognizing something he had been searching for long enough that he'd almost stopped believing it existed. What had changed in Michael's voice? This is the hardest part to describe in words, because the change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden power or a new technique or a stylistic shift you could point to on a waveform and say, "There, right there." It was more like a pressure releasing. The difference between a fist and an open hand. The voice became lower, fuller, more air in it, not louder, fuller, like the difference between a photograph of a landscape and actually standing in that landscape. Both show you the same thing. Only one of them lets you feel the temperature. Visual, let this breathe. Almost no movement on screen. There is a thing that happens in recording studios. Not often, maybe a handful of times in a career if you're lucky, where a voice stops demonstrating what it can do and starts simply being what it is. Gerald would spend years trying to find the right language for it. He eventually settled on this. It's the moment you understand what the word natural actually means when applied to a singing voice. Not untrained, not raw, not unpolished. Inevitable, like the sound had always existed this way and had simply been waiting for the moment nobody was holding it back. Somewhere in the second verse, Michael's voice caught slightly. A roughness on the upper register, technically imperfect, the kind of thing that gets flagged. Gerald's hand moved toward the talkback button. Quincy's hand came down flat on Gerald's wrist. "Don't." The take continued. When it ended, the control room held 10 seconds of silence. Gerald counted them. He would count them again every time he told this story for the rest of his life. Because that silence wasn't the brief pause before a producer reaches for the button. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of a take that didn't land. It was the silence of people who have just heard something that takes a moment to settle into the air before you can speak about it. Quincy pressed the intercom. "Come out." Michael came through the soundproof door slightly out of breath, eyes already moving, already reading the room before committing to any expression. He checked Gerald first, the way you check the face of the person who doesn't have a reason to perform, and Gerald's face told him something, but not yet how to feel about it. Then he looked at Quincy. Quincy picked up the legal pad and slid it across the table. On it, underlined twice in heavy black ink, were two words. I's voice. Michael looked at the pad for a long moment, then he looked at Quincy. And this is the detail Gerald always came back to when he told this story. The detail, he said, never stopped surprising him, no matter how many times he told it. Michael laughed. Not a performance laugh, not relief, not gratitude. A short, involuntary sound. The kind that escapes before you've decided whether to let it out. The laugh of someone who has just understood a thing that had been staring them in the face for months. He pressed his hand over his mouth almost immediately, like he was catching it. Quincy did not smile. He regarded Michael with the steady expression of a man who has confirmed what he already knew. 30 minutes, he said, then we go again. Michael nodded, walked to the hallway, and went outside. Gerald could see him through the small window above the emergency exit. He stood there for 22 minutes. Not packing, not on the phone. There were no phones in the modern sense, but you understand. Not talking to anyone, not doing anything at all. Just standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at a fixed point above the roofline. Los Angeles in October at midnight is a particular kind of quiet, cool still. The jasmine from somewhere up the hill, the distant friction of the boulevard. Gerald would be asked, many times over many years, what he thought Michael was thinking about in those 22 minutes. He always said he didn't know, but he had a theory. He didn't think Michael was thinking about the song. He thought Michael was thinking about every rehearsal he had survived by making himself smaller than he was. Every session where technically perfect had been the goal, because technically perfect couldn't be stopped and corrected and criticized. Every 3 a.m. song on the cassette recorder that had never made it to a microphone because the armor wouldn't let it through. He was standing on a sidewalk in Los Angeles at midnight, taking stock of what the armor had cost him, and discovering, in real time, that the number was higher than he had allowed himself to count. 22 minutes. Then he came back inside. No detour, no delay, straight to the booth, headphones on. He looked through the glass at Gerald. Then he turned slightly toward the intercom, not pressing it, just close enough that Quincy could see him. Quincy leaned forward and pressed talkback. His voice came through the monitor speaker, quiet and even. "Whenever you're ready, Michael." Michael closed his eyes. One nod. Gerald pressed record. What happened over the next 4 hours, Gerald has said, was the most significant thing he witnessed in 11 years behind that glass. And the word he has always refused to use for it is performance. A performance implies someone deciding how to present themselves, calculating the effect, managing the gap between what they feel and what they show. What Michael did was closer to what happens when someone stops translating and starts speaking in their first language. The difference isn't in the words, it's in the weight behind them, the things you don't have to think about, the meaning that travels without a middleman. Take after take, Quincy barely touched his pen. That was the tell for Gerald. In the previous 6 weeks, Quincy had filled pages. Notes, adjustments, ideas, questions. He wrote constantly. It was how he processed what he was hearing. Those 4 hours, almost nothing. Because he wasn't producing anymore, he was witnessing. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, Michael did something Gerald had never seen him do in 6 weeks. He stopped mid-take, not because something went wrong, the opposite, because something went completely right. He pressed the talkback from inside the booth. "Play that back." Now, in a recording session in 1978, engineers played things back at the producer's instruction, not at the artist's. That wasn't how it worked. That was the protocol. But Quincy didn't blink. He said, "Play it back." Gerald played it back. Michael stood in the booth and listened with his eyes open, head tilted slightly. Not the expression of someone waiting to be validated, the expression of a craftsman hearing his own work from the outside. assessing it the way you'd assess a weld or a sentence in a paragraph, with the cool, critical eye of someone who is now also a listener. When it ended, he put the headphones back on and nodded once. Gerald pressed record. This, right here, is one of the most under-discussed things about Michael Jackson, what that moment in the booth reveals. He had broken through the armor. He had gotten to the real voice, the 3 a.m. voice, the one Quincy had asked for, and his immediate instinct was not to be relieved or moved or emotional about it. His instinct was to evaluate it, to step outside himself and ask, is this actually what I think it is, or am I feeling it so strongly from the inside that I can't judge it anymore? That is not the instinct of a kid who got lucky. That is the instinct of an artist, someone who can simultaneously be inside the work and outside of it, someone who doesn't confuse emotional authenticity with quality. Michael Jackson at 19 was already both of those things. At some point past midnight, Quincy stood up and walked to the glass. He looked through it at Michael, eyes closed, one hand pressing the headphone cup against his ear, the other curled at his chest, the tendons in his forearm visible from the control room. He stood there watching for a while, and then he turned to Gerald. "You know what the difference is," he said, "between a good singer and a great one." Gerald shook his head. "A good singer gives you what you expect. A great one gives you something you didn't know you needed." He turned back to the glass, and his voice, when he said the next part, was quieter. "We've got a great one." Said simply, said quietly. Said to an engineer, not to a camera, not to a journalist, not to anyone who would repeat it in a way that mattered, in a room that wasn't being documented. Gerald carried that sentence for the rest of his career. And the thing that moved him most, he always said, was not the sentence itself. It was the timing. Michael was 20 feet away, in a booth, with headphones on. He couldn't hear it. He would never know Quincy said it. Quincy wasn't performing a compliment. He was registering an observation, as privately and honestly as a thought. I want to pause here and talk about something that I think tends to get lost in the celebrity mythology of Michael Jackson. When people talk about his vocal performances, particularly in this era, the off-the-wall era, they often use words like effortless and natural and instinctive. And those words aren't wrong, but they can create a misleading picture. Because what Quincy was calling the safe voice, the technically correct, emotionally buttoned-up instrument Michael brought to those first 6 weeks, that voice also took a decade to build. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't cowardice in any simple sense. It was architecture. Every controlled run, every precisely placed note, every technically flawless performance was a brick that Michael had laid, deliberately, over years, against the memory of rehearsals where his father stopped everything to tell him, in front of his brothers, exactly what he had done wrong. Against tour that started when he was 9. Against a music industry that had owned his voice since before he was old enough to understand what ownership meant. The safe voice wasn't a limitation. It was armor, and armor has a function. Armor keeps you alive. Armor allows you to walk into rooms that would otherwise destroy you. The problem, and this is the thing Quincy understood with unusual clarity, is that armor doesn't know when to come off. Armor doesn't read the room and say, "You're safe now, you can put me down." Armor just stays on, because taking it off is a risk. And the body, the psyche, the nervous system that needed the armor in the first place doesn't easily distinguish between the room where the armor was necessary and the room where it's become the obstacle. I think this is actually one of the most universally relatable things about this story, even if the specifics are as extraordinary as Michael Jackson's life. How many people are walking around in professional armor, in relational armor, that served a real purpose at some point, and is now the thing standing between them and what they actually want? How many people are giving the safe version of themselves in rooms where the safe version isn't what's needed? The armor keeps you from failing, but it also keeps you from succeeding, because real success in music, in work, in relationships, in whatever you care about, requires putting something actual on the line. That's what Quincy named on that October night. And it took 4 hours of recording after that conversation for Michael to begin, really begin, to figure out how to take it off. Off the Wall came out in August 1979. It sold over 20 million copies. It earned Michael his first Grammy as a solo artist. In fact, it became the first solo album in history to produce 4 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. Critics used words like arrival. They called it a coming of age, a mature statement, a sophisticated pop record. All accurate, all incomplete. Because what the critics were responding to, that particular quality in Michael's vocal performances on Off the Wall that felt different from everything he'd done with Motown, different from the Jackson 5 records, different from the Disney-fied youth pop machine that had contained him for a decade. What they were responding to was something that almost didn't happen. There was a parallel version of that album. Gerald lived inside it for 6 weeks. A version that was technically excellent and emotionally absent. A very good album that would have sold well and been remembered fondly and never become what it became. The difference between that album and this one is a single conversation. A legal pad turned face down. A fourth take. 10 seconds of silence in a control room on Santa Monica Boulevard. Michael was asked about Off the Wall many times over the years, and he consistently said 2 things about it that I find interesting in this context. First, he said it was the first time he felt like the record was actually his. Not his in the legal, contractual sense, his in the emotional sense. The sense of something that came from inside him rather than being assembled around him. Second, almost immediately after the final mix was done, he was standing in the studio listening to the playback, and when it ended, the room went quiet and he said, "And I want to get this right," he said. "We have to do something better." Everyone stared at him. He clarified quickly, "Not this one. This one is right. I mean the next one. We have to make a record better than this because now I know how to do it." Quincy was standing in the corner with his arms folded. He held Michael's gaze. And then, for the second time since the beginning of those sessions, he smiled. Not a professional smile, a real one. "Yeah," he said, "we do." The record they were talking about took 4 years. It produced 7 hit singles out of 9 tracks. It spent 37 weeks at #1 in the United States. It won 8 Grammy Awards in a single night, a record that stood for decades. It generated a live television performance. You know, the one that stopped conversations in living rooms the moment it came on screen, that people describe to this day with the specific reverence usually reserved for events they didn't actually witness but feel like they did. Thriller, 66 million copies sold, the best-selling album in recorded history. And here's what I want you to sit with. Thriller could not have existed without the conversation that happened 6 weeks into the Off the Wall sessions. Not because the production wouldn't have been brilliant, it would have been. Not because Michael wasn't talented enough, he clearly was. But because the particular quality that defines Thriller as a listening experience, that sense of a performer who is completely, recklessly, irreversibly inside the music, that quality had to be found first. It was found on a 4th take, in a studio that no longer looks the way it did. On a night that almost nobody documented. Gerald has been asked, over the years, to explain what made that night different. What made those 4 hours different from the hundreds of recording sessions he'd been part of before and since. He's tried many different answers. He's talked about the voice, about Quincy's stillness, about the 10 seconds of silence, about the way Michael evaluated his own playback like a craftsman. But the answer he keeps coming back to, the one he says is the simplest and most accurate, is this. It started when he stopped being afraid of himself. Not afraid of his father, not afraid of failure, not afraid of criticism, afraid of himself, of his own full capacity, of what it would mean to use it completely and find out, once and for all, what was actually there. Because as long as you hold something back, you can always tell yourself the best is still in reserve. You can protect yourself with the idea of what you could do if you really tried. The moment you actually try, really try, all of it you find out. And that's terrifying. Michael Jackson found out on a 4th take in October 1978. What he found out was that it was extraordinary. And then he spent the next 4 years figuring out how to do it again, bigger, on a scale the world hadn't seen before. That's the story, not the Grammy, not the moonwalk, not the mythology that built up around a person until you couldn't see the person anymore. The story is a 19-year-old standing on a sidewalk in LA at midnight, looking up at the roofline, taking a private inventory of what the armor had cost him, and deciding, quietly alone, to put it down. I've been thinking about this story for a while now, and I keep coming back to something that isn't really about Michael Jackson at all. Quincy Jones did something that night that is extraordinarily hard to do. He told someone the truth about themselves in a way that was precise enough to be useful. Not vague encouragement, "I know you have more in you." Not harsh criticism, "That take was bad." Something surgical, something that named the actual mechanism. "This is what you're doing, and this is why, and here's the cost of it." That requires an unusual combination of things. You have to know the person well enough to see the mechanism. You have to care about them enough to name it. You have to have enough confidence in your own perception to say it out loud. And you have to be willing to let them sit with it, to not rescue them, not soften it into uselessness, not fill the silence with reassurance. Most people don't do this. Most people either stay quiet because numbing someone's armor makes them feel exposed, and that's uncomfortable for everyone, or they say something so general it doesn't land anywhere. Quincy Jones did neither. He turned a legal pad face down and said exactly what he saw. And that conversation, that precision, that willingness to name the thing is what made the fourth take possible. Here's the question I keep asking myself, and I'll leave it with you too. What's the thing in your life that you're doing perfectly, technically, correctly, safely? That is also the thing keeping you from what you actually want to make. What's the armor that used to protect you and is now the cage? I'm not saying the answer is easy. I'm not saying you take it off all at once. I'm saying sometimes the most important moment is just numbing it, seeing it clearly, turning the legal pad over and writing 2 words. Yours probably aren't I's voice, but you know what yours are. Quincy Jones drove home that night along Sunset Boulevard with the rough mix in the car. He listened twice through, pulled into his driveway, sat with the windows down, played the last track one more time. Then he went inside, walked to his piano without turning on the lights, and sat down with his hands in his lap. He already knew what came next, had known the shape of it, the scale of what was possible now that he'd heard what was underneath the armor for 30 years of making music. The specific songs, the sounds, the production approach were still ahead of him. But the essential material, the thing you cannot manufacture and cannot teach but can only recognize when you hear it, he'd heard that tonight, through a pane of studio glass, in a voice that had finally stopped protecting itself. He sat in the dark at his piano, not excited, not triumphant. Something older and quieter than that. The feeling of a person who has found what they were looking for, and must now live with the weight of knowing what to do with it. Off the Wall came out, changed things. Michael looked at it and said, "We have to do better." Thriller came out, changed everything. But the night that made both of them possible, the real night, the foundational moment, was October 1978. Fourth take, 10 seconds of silence, 1 22-minute sidewalk in Lowe's Angels. The tape that almost wasn't. The armor that almost didn't come off. If this story hit you the way it hits me every time I sit with it, I'd really love to know. Leave a comment below about your fourth take. The moment you stopped holding back. The conversation that named the thing. Or if you're still waiting for yours, I want to hear that too. Subscribe if you want more of this. I'm telling these stories because I genuinely believe the moments that made the music are more interesting than the music itself. And this one, this quiet, undocumented, almost missed night, might be the most interesting of all of them. See you in the next one.